7 gunshots shattered the quiet of Vermont Vista in South Los Angeles at approximately 3:35 a.m. on Sunday, 19 July 2026. Most of those bullets left nothing more than holes in walls and parked cars belonging to nearby residents. But one found its way through the thin glass of a bedroom window where 3 people were asleep in the same bed: a 20-year-old mother, her partner, and their 1-year-old daughter. 10 minutes. That was all the time Maria Barrios Ventura had left from the moment the bullet struck her. Miraculously, the little girl sleeping beside her was unharmed, but she will grow up with no memory of the mother who held her close that night. Thousands of kilometers away in Guatemala, Maria's aunt could only follow the unfolding tragedy over the phone. Meanwhile, inside the bedroom that had suddenly become a crime scene, Maria's partner was left to face the unimaginable alone. Every spent shell casing, every witness statement, including that of a nearby resident whose car and home were also struck by gunfire during the same barrage, has been carefully collected by Los Angeles police. Yet, even today, the central questions remain unanswered. Where did the fatal shot come from? Who fired it? And why? Sometimes, the line between safety and tragedy is no thicker than a pane of glass. This is the story of an immigrant family separated by thousands of kilometers, yet united by love beyond borders. And it is the story of a little girl who will one day have to ask the question that still has no answer. What really happened that night? Before we begin, please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our future documentaries. Maria Luisa Barrios Ventura, 20, was one of millions of people who carried 2 homelands within her, born and rooted in Guatemala, yet building a new life in Los Angeles, the city where she chose to raise her daughter. Family members describe Maria as a devoted mother who put her daughter above everything else. Her aunt, Liliana Lopez, later wrote on the family's fundraising page that Maria's death left an irreplaceable void in the lives of everyone who knew her. Maria and her partner, Omar Misael, had built a small family together in the Vermont Vista neighborhood where they were raising their 1-year-old daughter. Like many young families in the area, their lives revolved around simple routines: going to work each day, caring for their child, and spending quiet moments together at the end of the day. Most of Maria's immediate relatives remained in Guatemala, a reality shared by many immigrant families in the United States, where generations of the same family can be separated by thousands of miles. It also meant that when tragedy struck, the little girl's immediate support network in Los Angeles was far smaller than that of families with large numbers of relatives living nearby. Vermont Vista, the South Los Angeles neighborhood where Maria's family lived, is a densely populated, ethnically diverse community made up largely of working-class residents, many of them from Latino backgrounds. It has also been mentioned repeatedly in reports documenting gun violence in Los Angeles, not because it is the city's most dangerous neighborhood, but because of the unpredictable and often random nature of shootings that have occurred there over the years. For many Latino immigrant families in the area, building a new life in the United States often comes with significant sacrifices. Many live far from their relatives and their homeland in the hope of creating a better future for the next generation, a story that was no different for Maria's family. Maria's daughter was just 1-year-old when the shooting occurred, far too young to retain any memory of that night, yet still at an age when the absence of her mother will leave a profound mark throughout the rest of her life. Most of the homes along 103rd Street in Vermont Vista are single-story or 2-story houses built decades ago, reflecting the typical residential architecture of South Los Angeles. It is the kind of neighborhood where families often remain for generations, and where neighbors generally recognize one another, even if they are not especially close. Before the shooting, there was no indication that Maria's family had been the target of any specific threat. There was no public information suggesting personal conflict, disputes, or any form of tension directly involving her family before that night. This became an important point for investigators. When an ordinary family with no known history of conflict and no apparent involvement in suspicious activity suddenly becomes the victim of gun violence in the middle of the night, the most likely explanation is often that they were struck by a stray bullet, an unintended consequence of another incident that was never directed at them. However, this remains only one of several investigative possibilities, and authorities have not reached any official conclusion. As of now, no public interviews with the family's immediate neighbors have been released through mainstream media, apart from statements made by relatives on the family's online fundraising page. The little girl's father, Omar Misael, has now become her sole caregiver, a responsibility that, only weeks earlier, he had shared with the woman he loved. The fundraiser created by the family was intended not only to help cover funeral expenses, but also to provide greater financial security for their daughter in the years ahead, as she grows up without the mother who once cared for her every night alongside her father. Within an immigrant community where extended family networks often play a vital role in sharing the responsibilities of raising children, Maria's sudden absence has placed this small family in an especially difficult position not only emotionally, but also in the practical realities of everyday life. On the evening of Saturday, 18 July, and into the early hours of Sunday morning, there is no publicly available information about what Maria's family did that day. To this day, neither the media nor investigators have released any specific details about this gap in the timeline. The only confirmed fact is that later that night, the entire family, Maria, Omar, and their young daughter went to bed together, just as they would on any ordinary weekend night. There had been no warning beforehand. There were no emergency calls, nor were there any reports of conflict or disturbances in the area before the shooting. By all accounts currently available, that Saturday night unfolded like countless other weekend nights in the Vermont Vista neighborhood. At around 3:30 a.m., while most of the neighborhood was still asleep, gunfire suddenly rang out. That brief period between the moment everything was still peaceful and the instant the first shot was fired remains one of the pieces investigators are still trying to clarify. They are seeking to determine whether there had been any warning signs in the area that simply went unnoticed at the time, or whether the shooting was truly a completely unexpected event. Police said the shooting was reported at approximately 3:30 a.m. This timeline is consistent with the account given by Omar Misael, who confirmed that the family was asleep when they heard the first gunshot. As of now, there has been no public confirmation of whether anyone other than the family members themselves witnessed the shooting. The exact amount of time that passed between the first gunshot and the moment Maria was struck has not been publicly disclosed. This remains an important detail in determining whether the bullet that hit her was fired at the very beginning of the gunfire or later in the sequence. For Maria's family, these were the final moments of an ordinary life before everything changed forever in an instant. According to Omar Misael's account to the media, it was not just a single bullet that was fired toward the house that night. A total of 7 shots rang out, striking nearby homes and vehicles before at least one bullet pierced the bedroom window where the family was asleep. In its initial reports, the Los Angeles Police Department confirmed that at least one bullet entered through the window and struck Maria while she was sleeping. According to police, she suffered a gunshot wound to the head. This is what made the incident especially tragic. Maria was not standing in a dangerous place, nor was she involved in any confrontation. She was in the place that should have been the safest, her own bed, inside her own home. According to Omar, Maria died about 10 minutes after she was shot. Their 1-year-old daughter, who was lying beside her at the time, was not injured in the shooting, a circumstance that, in many ways, can be seen as the only stroke of fortune in the midst of this tragedy. Police have not yet determined how many people were involved in the shooting that night, whether there was a single gunman or multiple shooters. This remains one of the central questions investigators are working to answer through analysis of bullet trajectories, the locations of the impact points documented at the scene, and the type of firearm believed to have been used based on the shell casings recovered. A bullet passing through the wall or window of a house, traveling a considerable distance, and still retaining enough force to inflict fatal injuries, is not uncommon in shootings that occur in densely populated urban areas. This is precisely why stray bullets have become one of the most alarming causes of death in many major American cities. Victims do not have to be present at the scene of the conflict, they may simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. The additional property damage documented at the scene, including at least one vehicle and the window of another house being struck by gunfire, showed that the impact of the shooting extended beyond a single home and affected the property surrounding neighborhood as well. Jose Chavez, who lives nearby, told reporters that both his car and the window of his home were struck by gunfire during the incident, and that one of his friends was also injured. "It hit my car, it hit my window, it hit my friend," he said. And sadly, she didn't make it. Mr. Chavez's account further reinforced the picture of a shooting that affected a broad area rather than being narrowly concentrated on a single specific target, an important detail investigators are considering as they examine whether Maria's family was deliberately targeted or whether they became unintended victims of another conflict that occurred somewhere nearby. When emergency responders arrived at the scene, they found Maria suffering from a gunshot wound. Paramedics immediately began providing emergency treatment, attempting to control the bleeding and stabilize her condition before transporting her for further medical care. However, the severity of the head injury meant that every effort to save her life proved unsuccessful. For Omar, who witnessed the entire incident from the very bed they shared, it was an experience beyond words, from a peaceful night's sleep, to the sudden sound of gunfire, to watching the woman he loved become unresponsive within just a few minutes. He later told reporters that he still could not believe his partner had died in such a way, shot while she was asleep, in the place where they had always believed they were completely safe. The entire sequence of events from the first gunshot to the moment Maria was pronounced dead unfolded in less than half an hour. It was a span of time so brief it seemed almost impossible. Yet it was enough to change the lives of this young family forever and leave behind the question that, to this day, remains unanswered. Who pulled the trigger, and why? For investigators, that brief period also meant there was very little opportunity for anyone, including the victims themselves, to observe or remember specific details about where the gunfire came from, the movements of the shooter, or any identifying characteristics that might prove useful. This is why the investigation has had to rely almost entirely on the physical evidence collected at the scene, rather than on direct eyewitness testimony. In the hours immediately following the shooting, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner took custody of Maria's body to carry out the formal identification process. This is a mandatory procedure in every death involving violence, ensuring the legal accuracy of the investigation from that point forward. The medical examiner later confirmed her identity in its online report, officially identifying the victim as 20-year-old Maria Barrios Ventura. Meanwhile, news of the shooting spread quickly throughout the Vermont Vista community early on Sunday morning. In a neighborhood where families often live side by side for years and recognize one another, the news that a young mother had been killed inside her own home quickly became a source of shock throughout the area. Local television stations dispatched reporters to the scene later that day, capturing images of the police cordon and the damage left behind by the overnight gunfire, shattered windows, bullet holes in walls, and a sense of grief that hung over the entire street. Shortly after the tragedy was confirmed, Maria's aunt, Liliana Lopez, created an online fundraising campaign to help support the family during this difficult time, with particular focus on securing a more stable future for Maria's young daughter, who had just lost her mother. In the fundraiser's description, Ms. Lopez wrote that it was a sudden and heartbreaking tragedy that had left the family devastated and struggling to come to terms with their loss. She described Maria as a loving mother, adding that her absence had left profound sorrow in the hearts of everyone who knew her. Within just a few days, the fundraiser received significant support from the community, including donations from complete strangers, who were deeply moved by the story of a young mother whose life had ended when her daughter was only 1 year old. Several major American news organizations also began reporting on the case during the following week. Reporters contacted both the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD, and the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department seeking official comment, reflecting efforts to carefully verify the facts before publishing them to the wider public. The growing media attention also reflected the extraordinary nature of the case, not only because of the devastating loss of a young mother who was killed while sleeping beside her child, but also because of the unanswered question that remained: what exactly happened, and who was responsible? The case also became part of the broader conversation about gun violence in urban communities across the United States, a problem that many public policy organizations have repeatedly warned about, particularly in relation to stray bullets causing death or injury to people with no connection whatsoever to the underlying conflict. According to data commonly published by law enforcement agencies across the United States, most victims of random shootings like this have no connection to the original motive behind the gunfire. They simply happen to be in the place where the bullet ultimately comes to rest after leaving its intended path. For the Ventura family, the days that followed were filled with turmoil. They had to prepare for Maria's funeral, respond to media inquiries, and care for the little girl who was now growing up without her mother, all while most of Maria's immediate relatives remained thousands of miles away in Guatemala, unable to be there immediately to provide support. As of the time this story is being told, mainstream news reports have relied primarily on statements from two direct sources: Maria's partner, Omar Mizael, and her aunt, Liliana Lopez. No friends, colleagues, or other acquaintances of Maria have yet given public interviews to the media, a gap in information that accurately reflects the reality of a case still in its earlier stages, when most reporting remains focused on confirming the basic facts, rather than exploring the victim's life in greater depth. This is also common during the early stages of any active criminal investigation. Journalists generally prioritize verifying and reporting the essential facts first, while more detailed accounts of the victim's life and the surrounding community usually emerge only as the investigation progresses and reporters have had more time to approach the family with care and respect. The fundraising campaign created by Ms. Lopez continued to receive donations in the days that followed, reflecting the widespread sympathy that Maria's story inspired not only within Los Angeles' Latino community, but also among complete strangers across the United States. Immediately after receiving the emergency call, patrol officers from the Los Angeles Police Department quickly arrived in the 103rd Street area. Following standard procedures for all firearm-related incidents, their first priority was to establish a secure perimeter around the scene, preventing anyone, including curious residents and members of the media, from entering the area until evidence collection had been completed. The familiar yellow crime scene tape was stretched along the street, enclosing not only the house where Maria was found, but also extending to neighboring homes that had reportedly been struck by stray bullets. According to Jose Chavez, LAPD crime scene investigators were deployed to conduct a thorough forensic examination. Their work included photographing the location of every bullet hole in wall and taking measurements to carry out preliminary analyses of the firing angles and trajectories of each round. With a total of 7 gunshots confirmed through witness accounts, the volume of physical evidence to be collected at the scene was substantial. Every spent casing and every bullet hole in a solid surface had the potential to provide valuable forensic information for accurately reconstructing the sequence of events. At the same time, officers conducted a door-to-door canvass throughout the surrounding neighborhood, gathering statements from any residents who may have heard or seen anything unusual around the time the shots were fired. This is a standard investigative step designed to maximize the chances of collecting witness information during the critical early hours after an incident, when memories are still relatively fresh. Police also reviewed private security camera footage from nearby homes and businesses, as well as public traffic cameras that may have captured images related to the incident, including the possible movements of suspicious vehicles in the area around the time of the shooting. Given the complexity of the incident, which involved multiple bullet impacts at different locations, the investigation was reportedly coordinated between local patrol units and the LAPD's homicide detectives, who have specialized experience in handling complex cases involving extensive physical evidence. Police also publicized a dedicated tip line, urging anyone with information about the incident to come forward. This included anonymous reporting through Crime Stoppers, a system commonly used in major American cities to encourage witnesses who are concerned about revealing their identity to provide valuable information to investigators. Determining the exact point from which the shots were fired, whether the shooter was standing in the street, inside a moving vehicle, or at another fixed location, plays a crucial role in narrowing the scope of the investigation. By analyzing bullet trajectories based on the angles at which rounds pass through windows and walls, forensic investigators can often determine the direction of fire with a reasonable degree of accuracy. However, with 7 rounds fired, investigators also had to consider the strong possibility that not all of them originated from the same location or even the same firearm, particularly since it had not yet been determined whether more than one shooter was involved. In densely populated urban neighborhoods such as Vermont Vista, maintaining a crime scene for many hours or even several days often causes significant disruption to nearby residents. Access to streets may be restricted, and some families may have to leave their homes temporarily if their properties also fall within the area requiring forensic examination. As of now, the LAPD has not released any detailed official report outlining the specific findings of the crime scene examination, including the number of shell casings recovered, the type of firearm identified through ballistic analysis, or any biological evidence that could directly link a specific individual to the shooting. This is common during the early stages of an active criminal investigation, as law enforcement agencies typically withhold sensitive forensic details to protect the integrity of the investigation and to distinguish genuine witnesses with valuable information from inaccurate accounts that may emerge after such details become public. This is one of the common paradoxes of an active criminal investigation. While the public and especially the victim's family naturally want as much information as possible, the investigator's decision to keep certain details confidential, frustrating as it may be, is often essential to preserving the integrity of the evidence and maximizing the chances of successfully solving the case. After the initial identification procedures were completed, Maria's body was transferred to the forensic pathology unit for a formal post-mortem examination, a procedure required under California law for all deaths involving violence or circumstances in which the cause of death must be formally investigated. The only publicly confirmed medical information released to date is that Maria suffered a gunshot wound to the head and, according to Omar Misael, died approximately 10 minutes later. This remains the only detail about the nature of her injury that has been widely reported by the media. In California, the Los Angeles County Medical Examiner is responsible for officially determining the manner of death for every case. These classifications generally include natural, accidental, suicide, homicide, or undetermined. In a case involving a fatal gunshot wound inflicted by another person, the death would almost certainly be classified as homicide, although the detailed official report has not yet been publicly released. In addition to determining the cause and manner of death, a standard post-mortem examination also includes toxicology testing to determine whether any alcohol, drugs, or other substances were present in the victim's body at the time of death. In this case, however, because the immediate cause of death was clearly a gunshot wound, any toxicology findings would most likely serve as supplementary information rather than a determining factor. Forensic pathologists also recover any bullet that remains lodged in the body, if present, so it can be submitted to the police ballistics laboratory. This is a critical step, allowing investigators to compare the projectile with firearms linked to previous cases and determine whether it matches any weapon used in other shootings, potentially connecting this investigation to other incidents of gun violence in the area. In Los Angeles County, a complete autopsy report including all supplementary laboratory findings typically takes anywhere from several weeks to several months to be finalized. This waiting period is often another difficult ordeal for victims' families, including Maria's, as they wait for the most complete and detailed account of what their loved one endured in their final moments. While awaiting the final report, the family is still able to proceed with funeral arrangements based on the preliminary confirmation of identity and cause of death provided after the initial examination. This parallel process is intended to ease some of the burden on families during the most difficult stage of their grief. For Omar and the rest of Maria's family, every stage of this legal process, from the confirmation of her identity to the post-mortem examination, and finally the release of the completed report, marked another painful milestone in the long journey of coming to terms with their loss. At the same time, each step was necessary to help ensure that those responsible would ultimately be brought to justice, if and when they were identified. As of now, the case of Maria Barrios Ventura remains unsolved. No suspect has been identified, no motive has been confirmed, and the most basic question anyone who hears this story is likely to ask: why her? And why that night remains unanswered. Maria's 1-year-old daughter will now grow up hearing stories about a mother she was too young to remember, a mother who died while sleeping beside her, holding her close in the very bed that should have been the safest place in the world for them both. Omar Misael, now raising their daughter alone, will one day have to tell her what happened to her mother, a conversation no parent ever imagines having to prepare for. For Maria's family in Guatemala, the thousands of miles separating them from Los Angeles have taken on an even more painful meaning. Not only did they lose Maria from afar, but they were also unable to immediately embrace their young granddaughter or be physically present during the family's darkest days. Maria's story also reflects a much larger issue across the United States: the tragedy of stray bullets, where the line between safety and disaster can be as thin as a wall or a window. She was not involved in any confrontation. She was simply asleep. Every year, hundreds of people in major American cities find themselves in similar circumstances. They have no connection to criminal activity, no known enemies, and no reason to become targets, yet they still suffer the consequences of bullets fired for reasons entirely unrelated to their own lives. The online fundraising campaign organized by Maria's aunt continues to receive donations, offering a small but meaningful reminder that her story has touched the hearts of countless strangers, people who may never have heard of Vermont Vista before, yet still felt the weight of the loss her young family now carries. The Los Angeles Police Department continues to investigate the case, although no official updates on significant progress have been announced as of the time this story is being told. The tip line remains open. Investigators continue to seek information, and hope, however fragile, has not disappeared for those still waiting for justice. For anyone who has experienced a similar loss, a loved one taken suddenly, without explanation, and without anyone being held accountable, Maria's story may stir familiar emotions. The helplessness of watching justice seem forever out of reach, and the painful possibility that the question of why may never be fully answered. But this is not the end of the story. The investigation remains open. The case file is still active. Every piece of evidence collected from the scene that night continues to wait for the moment when it may finally fit into a clearer picture. Until that day comes, if it comes at all, the final image of Maria remains the same: a young mother asleep beside her daughter, believing that, like every other night, this one would pass peacefully. For her little girl, life still stretches ahead. Even without her mother, that future can be built on the love of those who remain. A father doing everything he can each day, an aunt who stepped forward without hesitation to seek support, and a community of strangers who chose to show compassion through acts of generosity, however small. Although Maria Barrios Ventura's story has yet to reach its final chapter, one truth remains certain: a mother's love for her child does not end with her life. It continues to live on in the memories of those she left behind, and in the journey that awaits the little girl who will grow up carrying her mother's legacy.